the middle of July and it is time. Little buds are starting to form here at the end of the branches. The needles all have the same color, so that means the needles are no longer extending and the branch has stopped extending as well. That is the time for pruning pine. In this video I will cover how to prune pine. This part has been pruned, this I'm still pruning, and I'm basically just using a few very simple rules. Prune off the terminal buds. Don't remove needles by hand. Prune needles. Leave needles where you need them for later. And basically thin out more in the top than in the bottom. And that is roughly everything that I'm going to deal with in this video in more detail. But now at least you know the basic rules. If you recognize all of them, there's no need to watch. Unless you find it entertaining to see me get my hands all smeared with pine resin. You can see it is a fairly well developed pine, so the technique that I'm dealing with here is for pines that are further in the development, and they're not for very young trees that still need to beef up, that need to set their main branches. No, this is really where you're working on ramification and refinement. Let me continue pruning this and you enjoy watching the video. This pine was styled 2 years ago, it was repotted 2 years ago, and I left it mostly alone in spring so it could establish more strength. And that means it is now time, in the middle of summer, to prune some of these branches. When do you prune pine in summer? Basically, you prune the pine as soon as it stops growing for the year. What you can notice here, little buds are starting to form here at the end of the branches. The needles all have the same color, so that means the needles are no longer extending and the branch has stopped extending as well. That is the time that you can prune back these branches. And how far can you prune them back? Well, actually quite far. You can prune them back as far as there are needles here on the branch. Now, if you're wondering how far you can prune something like this back, fact of the matter is you don't need all that much in place. Just 4, 5 or 6 needle pairs are enough to keep this alive. But don't go to 0, because 0 means the branch dies. Because basically that is what determines how far back you can prune these branches. The question then becomes, why do you prune these branches? Well, in this case you see there's only one bud that has extended, and this has become a very long branch with very little side branches. So here it makes sense to say I'm going to go all the way back into previous year's needles. Just like that. So here on the other side we see the same thing. Only one bud has extended and the second bud has not extended. And I can now also here prune back substantially. These are all needles from this year, these are from last year. You can also see the length is quite different. Last year's are quite a bit shorter than this year's needles. Now what you can see here in this branch is that there is very old needles. This is from when I first styled it. There was a little bit of a branch left. Same here on the other side. Then there's a split. So this is where last year, or actually this spring, it started growing. These are the 2 buds of this year. And you can tell I've not cleaned out the candles because this one is a lot shorter than that one. So a typical move could be that I say, okay, I'm going to clip this one and make it exactly the same length as the other one. Now they are of equal strength and they don't compete to each other. Alternatively, and I'm not going to, I could prune back all the way here. Then new buds would form here at the base of these needle pairs. Now, because in the end I also want the profile to look nice and I don't want to rewire, I start at the top and there I prune back as far as I want to go. Because if I start at the bottom of the tree with pruning, then I might prune back too far and at the top I can't go as far anymore. Now what I don't do is pluck off old needles. I know that this is advocated by some, and particularly for black pine. This is often done, that you take a needle and you just pull it off. The problem with that, however, is here at the base of this needle pair is a little bud. If I pluck off the needles, then this bud will never develop. If there are a lot of old needles and you don't want to prune back as far. Here, for instance, I don't want to prune back all that far because I want to remain within profile. But there's a lot of needles here still on the branch and I don't want this branch to fatten. Then I just take my scissors and I just cut off a whole bunch of the needles right above the base. In this case I'm actually going to do it for all these old needles that sit here. And I just leave a tiny little stump sitting there. And this stump, of course, is where the bud is located, so I can still get budding here between these needles. There's one moment when you actually do want to pull away the needles, and that is when you're talking about needles that are growing down. Normally you don't need any branches growing down, So taking away needles that are growing down from the branch does two things. First of all, it stops buds from forming at the bottom of the branch, but at the same time it also cleans up the bottom of your foliage pad, so it looks a little bit neater. Just as a little warning, don't start with removing old needles from the inside, working outwards and then deciding where to prune, because it might mean that you've just removed needles that you need. So always first do the pruning, then do the cleanup of the old needles. As a matter of fact, I always like to keep needles as far as possible on the inside of these branches for as long as possible. Only when it really is getting congested, or I think that I have way too many buds already, that's when I'll remove the inner needles. But otherwise, leave some of them there, also for next year. That way new buds can still form in that single needle. It might look a little bit awkward if you are just looking at your tree, if you have just one needle sticking out here, but who is laughing when a little bud starts growing between those needles in 2 years' time? I don't want to remove all these needles, but I am doing this particularly in the upper half of the tree, because this is where most of the strength is, and that's why I need to remove more needles here in the top than in the bottom, so that the bottom branches relatively are made stronger again. Just make sure that every branch is a little bit longer than the one above it, and this way you keep the tree also a little bit in profile for the growing season. But yeah, as I said, wiring can also do this. These old needles might have a fungal infection, so it is really important that after you do all this work, you clean up after yourself and you remove all these old needles. That way you have less risk of reinfection. Now, why do I prune the candles right now? It actually has a few different reasons. First of all, I let all of these candles grow in spring because this tree needed its strength after 1 year of wiring, the second year of repotting. So I just let it grow, and therefore the tree grows big, but it also grows really, really dense, and that reduces the back budding on the inside on the one hand, and the profile extends quite a lot on the second. And the third thing that is happening is these branches fatten up substantially the more needles is there. So by pruning now, I'm actually working on all three of these elements. By removing a substantial amount of foliage, I ensure that there's less thickening of the branches. After all, fewer needles, less photosynthesis, therefore less sugars to build up wood. Next to this, I am reducing the length of the branch, and therefore I'm keeping it in profile, which also encourages more light getting in because there's less needles stopping the light from entering, and that in turn encourages light on the branches. Now, just light on the branches is one way that you encourage back budding, but also by removing all these end buds, I'm pushing the tree to think about creating new buds. So this is exactly the moment where you need to do this, in the middle of summer, just as the tree stops growing, because at that point the tree can still activate more buds on the inside, particularly at the base of all these needles, and then over winter these buds will open up, fatten up. They won't open up, they'll fatten up, and then in springtime they'll start growing from these new buds. Now, if there is a branch with a bud that is equal length, I'm actually taking off the last two needles with the final bud, so that both of these are pushed to create new buds. At the same time, what will happen is what you see happening here. These 4 needle pairs are a bud that just was created this year. The pine, after being pruned last year further down, has tossed new buds here on this branch. This is what we are after. These tiny little buds, they will ensure that over the years I can keep the tree at the size that I want it to be. This work is typically not done on trees that are in early development. This really is for trees that have had a few stylings, that are starting to become more compact, and that you're really developing into a more compact, refined, styled bonsai. You can tell here there's a nice structure already to the branch with a nice outline, a filled up pad, and this really is in the start of refinement. And therefore this work is done. You don't do this on very young trees that still need to grow lots and lots and need to fatten up, and you need to set your primary branches. Here I'm really, you can tell, these branches have already been set. This wire will go off soon. The main trunk line is set. This tree is getting towards a more mature bonsai stage, and actually next year I hope to put it in a decent pot. At some point this year I made a mistake with this tree and I double bent this branch, and as a result it has now died off on me. Such a shame. This was a nice little branch helping to fill this part up. Now with this branch here removed, that was the dead branch, this is starting to get a little bit awkward and overhanging, particularly because this profile is now very empty, but I'm going to leave it in place because when I start wiring, and that's going to be over winter, I can still wire some of these branches a little bit more outward and that way fill up the shape again. That also means that for this branch I'm going to have to pay attention that I don't prune too much. And actually there's a nice bud here, a nice bud there, and there's also 2 or 3 buds here, and there's another one there. So I'm going to leave all of this in place. I'm just going to thin out the needles a little bit so that I am able to wire this later on. If you leave needles, leave them on the outside of any fork that you have in the branch, because that way you get a bud on the outside growing away from the fork, easing the pruning back later on. And of course, you always leave all the needles around a freshly emerged bud. These are really sensitive, so don't damage them. Now if we put that all together, basically what you do, you prune the branch to the length that you want to keep, basically recreating the profile that you need. Make sure that at every end of the branch you remove the bud at least. Then you decide whether you need any buds on the bottom. Normally I don't, so I just pluck off the branches, or I just pluck off the needles that hang down. Keep in mind, needles that hang down can become needles that look upward if you rotate the branch during wiring. I'm not planning on doing that, so I'm just plucking off the needles that hang down. Having done that, I look at the branch and I decide whether there's any long sections, such as this one, where there is not enough side branches. And there I leave 1 or 2 needles at the base, and for many of the other needles I just thin them out. I leave a few more needles on the lower branch than the upper branches, but basically I prune back until there on every branch maybe 6 to 10 needle pairs. It might even be less if you're adventurous. Now here I see that there's a 1, 2, 3-way split, and I'm actually going to remove one of them, so I have a 2-way split. Do the same here, and I remove some of these inner needles, which are basically just cluttering up space, making sure that needles that are on the inside and relevant are left in place. Again, not all of them, just a few. Now this looks like there might be buds forming the way these needles stand, so I'm leaving all 3 of them. And then the last one here, do the same thing. Prune back the needles up to the sheet, leaving just a few needles at the end and a few needles at the branch itself to create later on side branches. Alright, this one main part of the tree is done. This is exactly the stage where I recorded the very first part of the video, if you've been paying attention. Let me just finish off this side as well, and then I'll flip the tree around and show you exactly what the tree looks like. Here I'm doing exactly the same thing, right? It really is not more difficult than that. Bonsai is, after all, just a repetition of techniques over the years, and that will cause you a nice bonsai. It is nothing that is done in 5 minutes. It is something that's done over the years. That is why bonsai takes a bit of time to create. Well, there you have it, all pruned back, ready for the rest of summer. I will clean up this pot a little bit. It has been a wet year, so this pine has been getting lots and lots of water. But eventually, this I am thinking about making my front. Now that this branch has died off, I might need to redesign. I'm thinking about removing this whole branch. Let me know what you think of removing this front branch or not, and just working with this small amount of foliage here. But this was a little bit of a summer update, a little warning that yes, it is time. And it is time for what? It is time to prune your pine. This was Jelle, growing bonsai. See you.